Hello, my name's Anne Hook and I'm the Publications Manager at Lymphoma Action. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on CAR T-cell therapy. The webinar aims to cover what this newer treatment therapy offers, how it works and what the process is for having it. We'll also hear from someone who's had CAR T-cell therapy about their personal experience of it. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panel of guests to introduce themselves and also to tell us a little bit about themselves. So if I can start with Kathy. Hello, Kathy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Anne, and welcome to everyone. So my name's Kathy Burton. I'm a consultant haematologist. I work in Leeds in the north of England. I specialise in lymphoma, particularly looking after both inpatients and outpatients with all types of lymphoma. And also part of my job is working in the diagnostic service, which is analysing bone marrow biopsies and lymph node biopsies, making a diagnosis of lymphoma. So there's two components to my job, which very much complement each other in terms of managing patients with lymphoma. In Leeds, we've been managing CAR T-cell patients now for about 2 years. So we have a lot of experience and we're looking forward to sharing that with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Kathy. And welcome also to Catherine, who sat with Kathy. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, my name's Catherine Riley. I work with Kathy in Leeds. I'm the CAR T nurse specialist. We set up the service during COVID and we started treating our first patients in March 21. My background is haematology, so I've worked in haematology for the last 15 years, both on the wards and as a nurse specialist.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally, we'd like to welcome Fiona, who has had experience of CAR T-cell therapy. Welcome, Fiona. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Anne. I'm Fiona. I live in Nottinghamshire and I received CAR T nearly 4 years ago. So I was very lucky to be one of the first people when it had been trialled. I'd had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2007 and it came back in 2019 and so I received more chemo and well, eventually I had CAR T. I think I've said enough now about me for now.
Well, if we can start with asking Kathy to give us an overview of what CAR T-cell therapy is and what it aims to do.
So I'm just going to share my screen and I hope people can see that. So I thought I'd just give a very brief introduction to CAR T-cell therapy because it can be a little bit confusing what this actually is and what the letters actually stand for. So in terms of CAR T-cell therapy, what the C stands for is actually chimeric, which is a bit confusing, but it really needs a component of parts. And what we're really talking about at the moment in the way we deliver CAR T-cell therapy is that this is individual treatment personalised for the individual patient and the individual cancer that that patient has. And therefore the chimeric bit is because it's a collection of proteins that change from patient to patient. And that's because they're particularly designed against the antigen that sticks out on the cancer cell of the individual patient. And what we're forming in terms of CAR T cells is actually a receptor that recognises that individual patient antigen on their individual cancer cell that therefore allows the cancer cells to be destroyed. And it's manipulation of the patient's own T cells, so as I say, individualised treatment per patient, that allows these T cells to be manipulated to form a receptor and can attack the antigen on the cancer cells and therefore treat the lymphoma. So just to show this a little bit more, there's a cancer cell here with a target antigen. The receptor has a hinge which is connected to a co-stimulatory and activation domain. And what really the important thing here is that this connection between the antigen and the receptor allows proliferation of these T cells and therefore destruction of the cancer cells. So what does this mean actually for the individual patient? So we collect white cells from the patient. So some of you that might have had a stem cell transplant before, you've been familiar with this, the leukapheresis process of collecting white blood cells. What's different with CAR T-cell therapy is that these cells are then taken away to a manufacturing lab. Within this lab, we isolate the T cells from the white blood cells and cause activation of these T cells. And then these T cells are engineered or reprogrammed to develop a receptor, the CAR T cell bit, using the CAR gene, so that there's a combination of proteins that form a receptor that then can target the individual cancer cell. And then these T cells have grown and expanded and proliferate, so there are a large number of T cells available to reinfuse to the patient. These T cells are then returned to the treating centre, and then what happens is the patient's given chemotherapy initially to lymphodeplete, i.e. reduce the level of normal T cells, and then they're reinfused with their own engineered T cells, which then attack the cancer cells. So just to show this here, I have a cancer cell, a CAR T cell, and it's this interaction between the antigen on the cancer cell and the receptor, the CAR T cell, that causes a process in terms of the DNA expansion and then release of these T cells that then kill the cancer cell. So hopefully that's described the process as occurs in terms of what happens in terms of the manufacture of CAR T cells and what that means for the patient in terms of the collection of T cells initially and then reinfusion of T cells after often prior chemotherapy or radiotherapy. This is just demonstrating to all of you the UK and Ireland CAR T cell centres that are open currently. So hopefully, therefore, you can identify a centre close to you who should be able to provide this treatment to you. That's just a brief introduction that I've given, talking about CAR T cell therapy and how it's manufactured. But now I'll hand over to Kath, and she can talk about some of the complications of CAR T cell therapy.
So this is the patient pathway. We get patients referred to the CAR T service from Leeds and also from around the area. And if it's a patient that's out of area, we'll come and see the lymphoma consultants first. So the local hospital teams will refer the patients in. They'll get assessed and then they'll take the patients to panel because there is a certain criteria that patients have to fill to be able to have CAR T therapy. If patients don't quite fit the criteria at the time, panel can normally make a recommendation, such as patients get further chemo or a biopsy, and then obviously we can go back to panel, or panel might agree that they just need that, and then we can carry on and give CAR T therapy. Once patients have been agreed to have CAR T therapy, we contact them and give them an appointment to come to the CAR T clinic. And so these are all based at Leeds. I always try and meet patients first of all when they come to the lymphoma clinic, just so that they know somebody already in the CAR T service, so that they've already met somebody, and then obviously if they have any sort of questions up front, that we can answer those. During this time, we might also be making arrangements in the background for patients to have apheresis and other appointments, because we need to kind of get patients in the system pretty quickly and for things to happen quickly once we've seen them in the CAR T clinic. So patients will have apheresis in the background, and other appointments made. You might need a line insertion, or if veins are really good, then we can just go from the veins. It is a bit time critical, as it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for the cells to be manufactured. So we need to get everything in place pretty quickly. So when patients come to the CAR T clinic, they'll meet a consultant and they will discuss medical history and physical fitness, strategies to optimise nutrition, which include taking certain vitamins that we use for nerve and brain function, which will become a bit clearer later on why we do that. Also, we stress the importance of keeping patients in really good shape physically so that you still meet the requirements for CAR T. So we will sort of give information on eating and gentle exercise, and we give leaflets out for that as well. So the provisional appointment, there will be opportunities to ask questions that you may have. We'll take baseline bloods at that appointment. We do take quite a lot of blood samples at that appointment, but it's just so that we've got a clear picture of what is happening with patients, and if we need to sort of replenish anything, whether any of the salts are low or anything like that. On the day of collection, when you come back for apheresis, patients are normally in there. It is normally a 1-day collection for the cells, and patients are normally in there for about 4 to 6 hours on the day. Those cells are then frozen, as Kathy said, and they're sent across to our labs. Normally they're in Amsterdam or in Europe, and those cells are reprogrammed. This process can take, as I said, 3 to 4 weeks, and it might be necessary to control the disease during that time. So we'll give some kind of bridging treatment. So that could be chemotherapy or it could be radiotherapy. The local teams can arrange that, and you can have that locally so you don't have to keep coming back and forward to Leeds. Sometimes it's not always possible to successfully make CAR T cells. If this happens, it might be necessary that we have to go through the apheresis collection again, but that's very rare that that happens. If the lymphoma progresses rapidly, or if health changes while the CAR Ts are being manufactured, it might not be safe to give CAR T cells. So we'll treat everybody on a 1-to-1 basis. We'll ask the patients to come back to the CAR T clinic sort of halfway in the point of the cells being made, just so that we can still see physical fitness, you know, so that we're making sure that patients are still fit to have the treatment. So there's practical steps that patients can take to keep themselves in good health. As I mentioned, gentle exercise and eating well. We monitor patients' height and weight just to make sure that they're on track. Once cells are ready and they've passed the quality process, patients will come back and have chemotherapy just before we give the cells back. That chemotherapy is a 3-day chemo. We do it here in our ambulatory care unit. If patients are out of area, they can stay. We have a hotel in the hospital, so you can stay in the hotel. Unfortunately, it's not the Ritz, so it's just quite basic really, but it just means that you're near and you're not travelling to and from. So we use this chemo as to prepare the body really to accept the cells. So it's to maximise a chance of survival for the cells and just prepare patients really. That normally happens on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Patients can go home on the Friday evening, spend Saturday at home, and then come back on the Sunday into the ward. We admit them to the ward and we give cells back the following morning. And we like patients to come the night before so that we can do blood tests and things like that, and just make sure patients are still fit, they don't have any infections. If there are any infections, we can treat them with antibiotics and we can delay the cell return by a couple of days. But that happens really rarely. So on the Monday, we give the cells back in the afternoon. They're given to the patients in their own room. So the rooms that the patients are in, they have an ensuite bathroom. So we give it in there, and we are similar to how we give other cells. We defrost the cells in a water bath, give the cells, and then obviously we monitor you while we're giving them for any side effects. And then that is the start really of the 14-day inpatient stay where we're monitoring people and, you know, just making sure that if they do have any of the side effects, that then obviously we keep on top of those. So the day of cell infusion is known as day 0, and then you are obviously in until day 14. The volume of the bag that we give is really quite a small bag. It's normally only ever 1 bag. We flush the bag out as well because there's millions of tiny cells in that bag, so we want to give all the cells to the patient. Some drugs like steroids will be restricted during that first part of the treatment and recovery, and also growth factors like GCSF. Some of the early complications once you've had your cells back are cytokine release syndrome, which we've shortened to CRS, infection, neutropenic sepsis, and also neurotoxicity. So the CRS, there's different grades of CRS. It's what happens when we give the cells back and the body gets overexcited really. It's trying to kill something, and the CAR T cells are making all these chemicals at the body. What are these? So things go a bit crazy really inside your body, and serious side effects of these can range from a fever at grade 1, above 38 is what we class as a fever, and those fevers can sometimes go up to 40 and above and be persistent over a couple of days. So there are treatments that we can give. If it's a fever of 38, we give paracetamol, but if it's creeping up to 39 and 40, and you've got a fever that lasts over 24 hours, we can give a drug called tocilizumab that just dampens down this response. It doesn't stop the cells from working, but it just stops all this really response in the body. Sometimes the oxygen can be a bit low, so we'll give some oxygen via a nasal cannula or a face mask. Low blood pressure can also happen in the first few days after treatment. But obviously we've always got things that we can give you to sort of counteract that. Sometimes the patient feels like they've got a bad case of the flu, but it's all these chemicals that are working in your body that the CAR-Ts are releasing. So CRS is what happens really when the CAR-Ts are doing their job. So up to 90% of patients might have some degree of CRS, and some patients, you know, it is the really, really minimal side effects that they get. Obviously, during our clinic appointments, when patients come, we do mention all these side effects. Sometimes there's a requirement that patients have to go to intensive care, especially if they get sort of the higher end grade 4s. So they may need more help with the breathing or more help with the blood pressure. Patients normally spend, the majority of patients normally spend a really short space of time in intensive care, but you've got one-on-one with a nurse there. So it is, you know, better for patients if they go to intensive care when they've got these more serious end of the side effects. Neurotoxicity is another side effect. So these are the neurological symptoms. Sometimes it can occur alongside CRS, but normally CRS is within the first 7 to 10 days, well, up to 7 days, and then neurotoxicity is sort of day 6 onwards, really. We monitor patients for all these side effects at least 3 times a day. If side effects are getting a bit worse, we will monitor longer. It's important as well to know that some of these side effects are similar to other sort of infections and things like that. So we would rule out other causes really. So we'd do blood tests and things like that and start on antibiotics just in case it is an infection, but it mainly normally isn't an infection. So these are some of the side effects from the neurotoxicity side. So seizures, possibly they're very rare. Confusion can be happen quite often, and it's when patients can't find words for things. We ask patients to write a sentence 3 times a day, and sometimes patients can't write that sentence very clearly, so that tells us that patients are having the neurotoxicity. A lot of patients will get a tremor, sometimes it's very mild, sometimes it's more pronounced, but that does tend to go over the course of a few days. These are the questions that we also ask throughout the 14 days as an inpatient, and it gives us an idea of if and when patients are getting slightly confused. You get a point for each answer. So if patients are not answering at 9 and 10, that's when we're becoming a little bit concerned that they're having neurotoxicity. And this is an example of somebody's handwriting. So on the left-hand side on day 4, the patients can write clearly. Day 5, can't really understand what that is. And day 6, the writing is back to being clear, but it's a different sentence. So that patient's still having neurotoxicities. On the right-hand side, it's somebody else's handwriting. Baseline is clear. Day 5 in the morning, can read it slightly, but some of the words are not quite right. And then in the evening, that patient had had some treatment that day, and the writing had gone slightly back to normal. So it is just a little bit not quite right, but patients can really sort of get back to normal really quickly when they do have neurotoxicity. So, but obviously we are monitoring patients constantly for that. As I mentioned as well, some of the short-term and long-term are infections. So while you're in hospital, obviously we're looking out for any kind of infections that you may get. Long-term, it's more chest infection type things. This is because actually we have taken away most of your immune system really. So we will look out for that. If patients get more than 2 or 3 infections in a short period of time, then we'll probably ask them to come back and have some immunoglobulin treatment. Prolonged blood counts as well are another long-term thing. So we will take blood counts pretty regularly for the first 3 months. If patients need blood and platelet transfusions, they can have them. And then normally after 3 to 4 months, patients are sort of getting back to normal with the blood counts, but obviously patients will still get monitored up to a year, but it just depends how they have reacted really and how quickly the bloods have gone back to normal. And then one of the other things is the vaccinations. All COVID vaccinations will be given from the beginning, 3 months after the CAR-T treatment, because obviously we've wiped out that response. And then when patients get to 12 months, then we'll start giving the, we'll ask the GPs to start the programme of childhood vaccinations, because they will have been wiped out as well. We monitor patients up to a year, but sort of day 28 and day 100 patients will be having PET scans just to see what the response has been to the treatment, and then we'll see them every 3 months up to a year, and the local teams will see them in that time as well, and after the year's up we'll discharge them back to the local team.
Well, thank you both Kathy and Catherine for that really clear step-by-step guide to CAR T-cell therapy. That's been incredibly interesting. Fiona, I'd like to turn to you now as somebody who's actually had this, and if you could share with us your experience of the treatment, the practical, physical and the emotional impact of having CAR T-cell therapy.
Thank you. Well, I have to say Catherine's description there was very, very accurate. Although I actually was in for 28 days, but that was 4 years ago, so obviously things have changed since then. I was very grateful to be offered CAR-T because, well, it was my last chance really, and I took advice from my consultant who I trusted implicitly, and he said CAR-T was an option for me. So I went before all the investigations, and yes, it was an emotional time because I didn't really know what I was going in for, and I did. I had lots of leaflets and I had been told very well, but it all went very well, and I had a lot of the things that you said. I had a fever of 40, had neurotoxicity, I had neutropenia. I avoided going into intensive care. I had an awful lot of blood tests over the time, pre the treatment. All the checks, you know, I had to have ECGs and all sorts of different checks to make sure I was fit enough to take the treatment, because it is quite taxing. But anyway, I did go through it and it was amazing. I had to go to London for my treatment because Nottingham wasn't able to do it at the time, and I had such an amazing team. I was in a room for literally 28 days, and until the last week really didn't go out of that room at all. I was allowed visitors. They were screened, and it was pre-COVID at the time, thank goodness. Is there something else I should add, Anne, that I've forgotten?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear about the physical aspects. I know Catherine showed, you know, those illustrations of people needing to do the handwriting. Did you feel it quite?
Yes, indeed. I had to write every day the same sentence, which was basically, I am in whichever hospital and I'm having CAR-T, and today is Sunday or whatever. And my writing was terrible, and it was over 28 days, and my daughter-in-law's birthday was within that time, and when my card arrived she couldn't believe the writing. She said, you know, your writing's normally very good. I don't think it's ever come back properly, but yes, I can still write properly now. So yes, that was definitely, and I lost control of all my bodily functions at one time, which wasn't pleasant. I had to be bathed by a nurse, sitting on a seat in a shower, or showered by a nurse. Never has that happened to me before, but there was nothing I could do, and I was very grateful. I had a high temperature, I had Rigors, I had several drips, I think paracetamol and, well, lots of fluids, I guess.
And how long did these tend to last, Fiona? Was it a short space of time, several days, several weeks? What?
Not several weeks, but I think initially, I mean, the actual drip that puts in the T cells is so small and seems so insignificant, but is massively important. And after that, I thought, well, I feel fine. But by day 4 to 6, that's when it all started to happen. And yeah, Rigels, I seem to remember asking for blankets because I was cold, and I'm sort of almost feeling it now. It's strange. Yes, I felt very out of it. Apparently I was very out of it, but I didn't probably realise. All my visitors told me afterwards, or have told me in recent times, that they were very worried about me. But anyway, I'm here and I'm very well, and my team were wonderful. And as far as I'm concerned, you just have to have trust in your team.
Thank you for sharing that. This is a relatively new treatment option for lymphoma. And can you tell us about the types of lymphoma it's used for? Because I know a lot of people are confused because it's called CAR-T. They assume it's only for people with T-cell lymphoma. So I wonder whether you could enlighten us on who's able to receive this treatment.
Thank you, Anne. I think this is a really important question because it is only approved for certain types of lymphoma currently. It is likely to change in the future, but presently it is available for patients who have diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, so that's high-grade lymphoma, who initially it was available third line, i.e. for patients who'd had a first line of chemotherapy, invariably R-CHOP chemotherapy, followed then by second line chemotherapy, and usually an autograft or transplant if they were fit enough for that. So, and then subsequently, if they relapsed after that second line of chemotherapy or after a transplant after second line of chemotherapy, then they would be eligible, as in the case of Fiona, to have CAR T-cell therapy. So that's the first sort of indication of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. It's become more permissive over time, that third line DLBCL type treatment. So that does now include patients who have had low grade lymphoma where it's transformed to a higher grade lymphoma and where they have had R-CHOP type therapy or anthracycline based therapy at a point in time due to transformation. I think it's also important that some patients have specific follicular lymphoma called grade 3B, which is more like a high-grade follicular lymphoma. They are now eligible. And patients now for third-line DLBCL who have CNS involvement, they are now eligible for CAR T-cell therapy, which they weren't at the outset. So for patients who have either transformed lymphoma or diffuse large B-cell lymphoma who have had 2 prior lines of therapy with or without an autograft, are now eligible for third-line CAR T-cell therapy. It's also approved for primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma third line as well. So that's a specific type of high-grade lymphoma that arises in the mediastinum. Then, as of this year, we've had approval for high-risk diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So this is patients who are either refractory to the first line of treatment, normally R-CHOP, or who relapse within 12 months of treatment with R-CHOP chemotherapy for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And those patients can now have CAR T-cell therapy second line, don't need to wait until third line. So that's really an alternative to second line chemotherapy and a transplant. But just to be clear, that's patients who haven't responded to first line therapy or who relapse promptly within 12 months of treatment. The other indication for CAR T-cell therapy is mantle cell lymphoma, so we've not really talked about that. So that's for patients who've had first-line therapy, normally combination chemotherapy or DHAP with CHOP, and then have to have received a BTK inhibitor, and for most patients that would be ibrutinib, and then if they fail after ibrutinib, then they would be eligible for CAR T-cell therapy. It's not currently available yet for follicular lymphoma. There are clinical trials using CAR T-cell therapy in follicular lymphoma, but that's not yet been approved. and there isn't CAR T-cell therapy available for T-cell lymphoma, for example, you mentioned, or for Hodgkin's lymphoma. We're all hoping that these will be available in the future, and there are clinical trials undergoing currently, and the same with CNS lymphoma. At the moment, there are clinical trials running predominantly in London, but not that's not more widely available. So we're really talking about second and third line diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and mantle cell lymphoma.
I've got a question for Kathy and Catherine, whichever. The question is CAR T suitable for anyone, or are there limitations, for example, somebody's health or their age?
Well, I'll start and then Kathy will fill in. So there are, so Kath talked about the fact that to be approved for CAR T-cell therapy, you have to go through a national panel, and therefore there are criteria that you have to prove to the national panel in terms of being eligible and fit for CAR T-cell therapy. So you do have to have a good performance status, so that's described as ECOG 0 or 1. So that's really that you're able to do daily activities and care independently for yourself. And otherwise, in age, there isn't exactly a cut-off as such, okay, but I was just talking about the third and second line CAR T-cell for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So for those patients who are potentially eligible for second line diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, so for those patients who've just failed one line of chemotherapy, they have to be regarded fit enough for an autograft. So they would have had an autograft if CAR T-cell therapy wasn't available. That's slightly different for third line. You can have CAR T-cell therapy even if you have been deemed ineligible for an autograft before. So what that really indicates is generally the third line treatment is available for slightly older people than the second line currently. I think that might change over time, but I think that's the right approach, and that's what's been sort of approved by NHS England. Otherwise, in terms of this all depends really in terms of fitness for the CAR T-cell therapy. As both Kath and Fiona very well described, this isn't a walk in the park. This is tough therapy, and therefore people do need to seriously consider that in terms of other comorbidities. The general fits, we're very good at assessing cardiac function, pulmonary function, and really the most important thing is optimizing that prior to initiating therapy. So we often get respiratory physicians or the cardiologists involved to support patients and to optimize any treatment they're on prior to CAR T-cell therapy. So I think one of the important things is discussing with patients from the outset what this involves. This is tough therapy. It's also having sort of being physically fit, psychologically fit, but also having the social and the network support. I think that is very important, and I think it's taking all that into consideration when you're thinking about a patient suitable for CAR T-cell therapy. Kath, I don't know if you want to say that.
Yeah, I don't think there's very much to add. I think physical fitness is a massive part of it. You know, you definitely get deconditioned when you are a hospital inpatient, especially if you get the side effects. So being physically fit and trying to keep physically fit in hospital is really a big part of kind of getting through the treatment as well. Obviously appetite goes, things like that, so we advise patients to bring snacks in, things that they like to eat. You know, there's fridges in patients' rooms, so you know, it's just trying to keep as well as possible in the circumstances, which sometimes is quite difficult. Spending 2 days in bed, you've lost muscle mass, it's, you know, harder to get out of bed, things like that. We refer our patients to physios, you know, pretty early on, OTs as well if they need it, and dietitians see them as soon as they are admitted, so that we try to keep on top of everything and try to keep patients, you know, as fit as we can.
Thank you. The next is about preparing or being told you might be having this treatment. So the first question I'd like to put to Kathy is, how and at what stage might you talk about CAR T-cell therapy with one of your patients?
I suppose this depends a little bit whether these are patients that we're treating, for example, in Leeds, or whether these are referrals from outside Leeds, but we try and approach them all in the same way. So I suppose one thing to say from the outset is we've been very proactive in making it clear to hospitals around us that we now provide CAR T-cell therapy, and therefore should be considering patients who are relapsing either after first line or second line treatment for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and then also for patients with mantle cell lymphoma who are on ibrutinib, monitoring these patients closely so that if they do relapse, referring them for CAR T-cell therapy. Because I think one of the most important things we know is probably about a quarter of the patients that are approved for CAR T-cell therapy ultimately don't get CAR T-cell therapy, and that's because they progress in the time between us collecting the T-cells and the manufacturing stage, which does take a few weeks. So I think the most important thing really is in MDT discussions or when patients are seeing their local consultant, that if there's any indication, for example, that they're not responding well to therapy midway through their treatment, or if at the end of treatment scan isn't optimal, then CAR T-cell therapy is considered early in their treatment course.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the other questions was, do you consider things like the geography of where somebody lives? But if they live remotely from a hospital, is that going to limit their ability to have this treatment or not?
So I think obviously that's difficult, and initially there were only a few centres in the country that were providing this treatment, and patients were having to travel long distances. Now there is a reasonable geographical spread that's obviously been intentional in terms of there being units in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. So I don't think that should preclude at all patients receiving the therapy, but I think you need to understand that provision, as Kath has talked about, in Leeds we have hotel or accommodation for up to 28 days. So actually people from quite far away can come and have the treatment. They can reside in hospital for a month. But you do need very good connections with the local referring hospital, because there are frequent blood tests. As we talked about, maybe the bridging chemotherapy or radiotherapy you have between the apheresis and receiving the CAR T cells. If that's all managed locally, it means that patients can stay closer to home for longer. So I don't think there's any reason why those patients can't be treated, but it does just require maybe a little bit more organisation.
And I wanted to ask you, Catherine, what are the most typical questions you get asked by patients who are about to embark on CAR T-cell therapy?
I'm not sure there's any typical ones. We get asked quite a lot of things. So patients want to know, if they can have visitors. That's quite a big thing. Obviously, they want to keep in touch with the family and friends. When patients come to us in one of our clinic appointments, we tend to take them round the unit and show them where everything is. We'll take them to the ward if we can, show them where they'll be staying. So obviously they want to know what kind of a room it is, but everybody stays in their own room with an ensuite bathroom. And I think a lot of patients want to know what they'll be doing day to day as well. So we'll ask them to bring things in that they like to do. There are televisions provided in the rooms that they can watch free of charge. We've had people bring massive jigsaws in and do jigsaws while they're here, or people doing the knitting and things like that. And I think really, a lot of the questions are around sort of when they'll know whether the treatment's worked, really. It's quite of a, from beginning to sort of knowing that at the 3-month scan, it's about a 5 to 6 month period. And it seems like it's a really long sort of space of time, but it goes so quickly. But I think a lot of patients are, sort of worried about if the treatment's going to work and the length of time that it's going to take for them to find that out, really.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because actually through the audience we've got today, we're getting a lot of questions, all very similar note, which is about the success of CAR T. Is it technically a cure or not for these?
I think Fiona is a very good example of what CAR T cell can achieve, and I think with Fiona being nearly 4 years out now from CAR T cell therapy, would be very optimistic really in terms of her outcome. Cure is not something we use very often in haematology, but I think what we really are seeing is sort of a plateau on a curve. So if patients do appear to have a very good response to CAR T cell therapy, so often assessed or are assessed at day 28, and then a day 100 post the CAR T-cell therapy. And then if a remission sort of year after CAR T-cell therapy, then that does appear for most patients to be maintained, which is very optimistic, really. As time goes on and your disease doesn't come back, then I think patients can be reassured that they're cured. In terms of overall, probably the sort of initial trial data and the real world data is probably quite similar, and probably about a third of patients have a long-term remission with CAR T-cell therapy. So that's really saying that some patients obviously die from the therapy. It is intensive therapy, and then there are patients that then, although tolerate the therapy well, then their disease progresses. But I would say probably about a third of patients, 35 to 40% of patients, could hope for a long-term remission post-CAR T-cell therapy.
And can I turn to you, Fiona, and ask you about follow-up? Are you still having very regular follow-up?
Yes, I do. London still ring me. I think I'm now at annually, but I still see my consultant every 2 to 3 months, or speak on the phone as we do now. But I also am having immunoglobulin every 3 weeks because my lymphocytes are my levels are very low. My immune system is not very good. So, you know, I'm having as much protection as I possibly can. So I go into the hospital every 3 weeks for 5 hours and have this treatment. But again, it's only immunoglobulin, but I think it is very important. Is it, Kathy?
Yeah, that's one of the long-term complications is recurrent infections, and obviously COVID has highlighted that even more to all of us, really, the potential of sort of viral infections. So immunoglobulin is very effective, a monthly infusion, at increasing your own immune system and therefore reducing the frequency of infections.
I've got another question again, and Kathy or Catherine might be best on this. How long do CAR T cells stay in your body?
Yeah, it's quite difficult to answer, really. We don't know is the actual answer, really, because you can't really measure CAR T cells in the body. So it's thought that it could be months, possibly up to a year, but it's really difficult to sort of say how long they last, and it's individual for each patient. But there isn't a test that we can measure CAR T cells in the body, so we don't know exactly.
What sort of immediate side effects are you looking out for when people have treatment, which you covered quite well, but why do they happen? Are you able to explain why these side effects happen?
So for when the patients are inpatients for the first 14 days, so like I said, it's normally a temperature that we see first in patients. And then sometimes that might be a bit of a drop in blood pressure, or maybe they might need some oxygen. And then obviously it moves on to the neurotoxicities like the handwriting and confusion and things. But all these side effects are happening because of how the CAR T cells are working in the body, really, with the chemical release. And then obviously long term with the low blood counts and things, it is because the CAR Ts are still working, and also because it takes longer for your bone marrow to recover to sort of make some of these cells again. And obviously things like getting infections once you've been, you know, a few months down the line, like Fiona said, it's because your bone marrow is still recovering, and it can take a long time for bone marrow to recover and get back to normal, and that's why there's a requirement for still blood and platelets. And obviously if patients are getting infections further down the line, the immunoglobulins.
Thank you. I'm now thinking about physical impact and recovery, and I'd like to turn to Fiona and ask you, how did you feel physically after your treatment?
When I came out of hospital, I went to stay with my son and his family, and it was wonderful. Because I did feel a bit I felt very safe in the hospital, institutionalized or whatever, but I was very safe. And I was told that if anything happened, you know, I had fevers or anything, I had to contact them and get myself back there. I had to be within an hour of the hospital. And I was very tired. I didn't realise how tired I was, but I used to sort of fall asleep in the middle of a conversation almost. But I built up my strength. I walked with the grandchildren, and I did lots of things with them, and my strength got better and better. But I think it takes a long time to get over this. Well, it did me anyway. I didn't realise it did, but I know now that I wasn't able to do the things that I can do rushing around now. I mean, a walk with my dog was, you know, just down to the corner of the road and back, or across one field. But, you know, I've built up my strength. I know my immune system's no good. And I also, one thing I forgot to say was, I used to have, I can't remember what the injections were called, but I had to do them. I did them myself, brought them home from hospital, and had to inject my tummy. What was that for? I can't remember.
Probably growth factor injections to
yes.
Yes.
So I did do that, and it was just took a long time. But I mean, I felt quite special at the time because I'd had this wonderful treatment, and I'd come through it. But I was watched very regularly by my consultant. I'd felt very protected in the hospital, and when I came out, I felt quite vulnerable. You know?
Yeah, and it sounds to me one of the things that helped was that gentle exercise that you gradually built up. That sounds like it was important.
Exercise is terribly, terribly important. Just to be out there and doing things because you've been in a hospital. I mean, towards the end of my treatment or my stay in hospital, the physio used to come in, well, every day, but then she'd say, come on, let's go for a bit of a walk. And we actually walked along Edgware Road, which was quite busy. And I really sort of thought, oh, I'm out of hospital, you know, and I used to go further and further with her, and she stepped me up. And I also had reflexology, which was wonderful, every 3 or 4 days. This lovely man came in and worked on my feet with some lovely music, and it was very relaxing. That was very important to me, to be looked after so well. Yeah.
And it sounds like recovery is a slow and steady pace. Roughly, if somebody asked Kathy and Catherine how long it is from the time you first have your CAR T-cell therapy to feeling like you are well on the way to recovery, what sort of timescales are we talking about here?
I think that does really vary from patient to patient, and how unwell they've been in the time they've been in hospital and had the CAR T-cell therapy. Like with any treatment, some patients have very mild side effects, and some have more pronounced side effects. But you know, definitely for the first month after treatment, really, as Fiona describes, you're going to feel very weak and debilitated. Really, you would hope maybe 3 months after CAR T-cell infusion, you're feeling a lot better. As I said, you have a day 100 PET scan at that point, and I think that's helpful for patients because that's almost a landmark. And if that PET scan's good, then people feel better. I think, you know, obviously, yes, there are the ongoing blood tests, the immunoglobulin infusions, etc. You know, and I think it can be a long road to recovery. I think it does depend a lot what prior treatments patients have had. You know, some patients have had a considerable amount of treatment really before they had CAR T-cell therapy, particularly patients who have relapsed very promptly. Fiona described, obviously, she had a very long period without disease, and then the lymphoma came back. I think patients that have had multiple lines of therapy in quick succession, then I think that can be quite difficult for them. So I think it does vary, but I don't think it should be underestimated how tough it is.
I'd like to ask one more question. I'm very mindful that the time is running short and we could talk for hours longer, I think. But one of the questions I've got is to ask Catherine whether you undertake nurse-led clinics for follow-ups for CAR T-cell therapy. Do such things happen?
Yeah, so at the moment, I know Fiona said that she was an inpatient for 28 days. Here it's 14 days. The following 14 days, if you live within an hour's radius, you can go home. If not, we've got an apartment in the city centre that patients go to. And part of that 14-day is a nurse-led follow-up. So you've got a mixture of nurses, consultants and pharmacists, because we see you nearly every other day really in that 2 weeks. Following on from that, we don't have a nurse-led follow-up clinic. Patients come back and see consultants every 3 months, but we do keep in touch with patients still very closely especially in the first 3 months. Maybe we're organising things with local teams and things like that. But that is something that we are looking to do in the future, but we don't do it at the moment.
I know we haven't managed to answer all the questions that were put to us before this. I think we could talk for another hour easily, but if anyone in the audience wants to find out any more about CAR T-cell therapy, then please do go to our website, where you'll find quite a bit of information, including some videos of Fiona actually, where she talks a bit more about her experience, so you might find those really valuable as well. So before we leave, I'd really like to thank Kathy, Catherine and Fiona for giving your time today and for giving us such an insight into this complicated treatment. Thank you once again to our panel. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for listening, and I hope you found it valuable. I certainly found it fascinating.